Welcome, everyone. This hot topic is called Why It's Important to Know and Practice the 5 Categories of Boundaries with Vanessa Bennett. This is presented by Athleta. Just a little bit about Vanessa. Vanessa is an author, licensed holistic psychotherapist, clinical entrepreneur, and mental health content creator. Her therapeutic approach integrates years of study and practice in depth Buddhist and yoga psychology. She co hosts the Cheaper Than Therapy podcast. I love that name. Leads soul based retreats, workshops, and creates and facilitates curriculums for nonprofit and corporate training events and conferences. As an Athleta Well Guide, she supports Athleta's community by providing credible resources and support to women and their well-being journey. I love that you do all of this.
I do a lot. I also have a 3-year-old.
Oh my God. How?
I know. Well, let me start by saying my voice is a little hoarse because of said 3-year-old.
Yes.
But all of you understand what that's like when you have a toddler who's in daycare and every day's an adventure. What virus will we have this week, right? So that's what I'm dealing with right now. So if I cough, I'll try to turn my head. I have a ton of different topics that I speak on. Obviously, I'm a licensed therapist. I run retreats multiple times a year. I've been working with Athleta now for the last year, making content for them. But I thought for this group, the workshop that I usually give on boundaries, which I usually take 2 hours to do, I'm going to condense into 20 minutes and hopefully have time for Q&A. And the reason why I thought this was a good one is because I feel like boundaries is such a hot topic, right? It's such a buzzword these days. But there's a couple things. So one, the way that we talk about boundaries in the social media kind of wellness landscape in many ways is all about the other person, right? So it's like, I'm going to set a boundary and it's about that person. Like, you've crossed my boundary. That's actually really not how boundaries work. When we're talking about it from a therapeutic perspective, it's about you, right? So you need to know yourself well enough to know what your boundaries are. And then the actual boundary takes place when you act on someone potentially crossing that boundary, right? So it's not about somebody doing or not doing something. It's about what you're going to do when they do or don't do what your boundary is, right? And so I talk a lot about the different categories of boundaries because I think it's important for us to break down that there are actually multiple versions, variations of boundaries, and we should know about them. Yeah. So I'm going to go through, I actually recently, in the last few months, I added a 6th category. So even though the title of this is 5, you're going to get 6. I know, right? A little extra credit for you. So the first category of boundaries we talk about is emotional boundaries, right? So this is like when you think of taking on somebody else's emotions. So that term empath, right? I don't know where I end and you begin, right? I walk into a room, I can feel the energy. Somebody else walks into a room, I can feel their energy, right? This is showing compassion to somebody without trying to fix it or save them, right? That would be an emotional boundary for yourself. This is having barriers from inappropriate topics. So that would be an emotional boundary, right? I know that this topic kind of sets me off or makes me uncomfortable and I don't want to talk about it. So that's an emotional boundary that I might set. This is also kind of on a spectrum. You've got those good vibes only people that walk in and they don't want to have anything negative in their lives, which we call bypassing. Or the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be more like that energy vampire or kind of like the Eeyore, like we all know an Eeyore, right? Everybody knows an Eeyore. Either one of those would be somebody who kind of struggles with emotional boundaries, right? The second category would be mental boundaries. So this is things like our thoughts, our values, our opinions, our beliefs, okay? So this is all about you preserving your freedom of thought, right? And this is where the importance of critical thinking comes into play, right? So people who don't have strong and healthy mental boundaries might be more susceptible to groupthink or more susceptible to kind of just believing everything they see on the internet, right? Without actually doing the critical thinking work that goes into figuring out for themselves if they, if it's really true or not. The third category is physical boundaries, right? So this one is kind of common sense. This would be think physical space, right? Sex, touching, close talking, right? We all have those close talkers in our lives. Proximity, Unwanted comments on appearance can actually be a violation of physical boundary, right? And I see a couple heads shaking. So as women, I think most of us know that. And then there's just those people that make you feel physically uncomfortable, right? Just like in your space and you just have that vibe. That's a physical boundary that our body actually kind of can sense at an unconscious level. Then you've got the fourth category. So this is time and energy. Okay, this is actually a category of boundary, right? So this is time, lateness, when to contact somebody or not contact somebody, right? This is also favors, free labor, things like that. So that would be under the category of time and energy boundary. And then the fifth one is material. So material boundaries, right? Possessions, when they can be used, how you will let them be treated, things like that, right? Now, I don't give you these five, and I'm going to give you the sixth in a second to kind of overwhelm you. Like, oh no, I have more things I have to work on, right? Oh shit. I thought I had boundaries covered. Now I got 5 categories to go through. I think it's more about just having a deeper understanding of, and when I do this workshop, the 2-hour-long workshop, I actually had people really sit and go through in depth each of these categories and start to decide or kind of examine where they feel like they're maybe lacking, where they feel like they could strengthen a little bit more, right? Because some of us have really good like material boundaries, but have really diffuse like emotional boundaries, for example, right? It's not that you're like horrible at all of them usually. It's usually like, I could strengthen one or the other. So this last one, the sixth one, is actually spiritual boundaries. So I talk a lot about this one because I think it's become a little bit more prevalent recently in the work that I do with a lot of moms, which is really this relationship with what's bigger than yourself, right? And this doesn't necessarily mean religion. This isn't about what your belief is, but so my background's in depth psychology. It's Jungian based, and Carl Jung really believed that our path of individuation, our path of self-actualization must include a spiritual component. It doesn't, again, have to be religion, but it has to include something that helps ground you in a sense of, I am a part of something larger than myself, right? That might be community. That might be religion, obviously, but it is very important to the soul. It's very important to the psyche that we are connected in some way to something larger than ourselves, right? And so there's also boundaries that come into play with that, right? So this has to do with just being very strong in your belief, and again, critical thinking, like not allowing people to kind of overstep what that boundary is for you. So that was a very quick, let's run through the 6, but I do have a little bit of a prompt for you all, and then I want to give you back the microphone because I'm sure you have questions too. So what I want to first say is boundaries are learned, okay? None of us came out of the womb with boundaries or understanding boundaries, right? Any of us who grew up with any parent who didn't have strong and healthy boundaries, that's what we see. It's modeled, right? So then us with our children, it's the same. So if we work on strengthening our own boundaries, our children will then in turn learn to have better boundaries themselves, right? Children do not learn what they hear, they learn what they see. Right? So if we take care of ourselves, they learn to take care of themselves, right? If we have shitty self-talk, they will have shitty self-talk, right? That is how it works with kids. So I just want to reiterate, boundaries are learned, okay? So I say that to say none of you are failing. Like, again, none of us came out of the womb knowing this stuff, right? It's all trial and error. And also, a little bit of boundary work comes from trial and error, like I just said. This is not a test that you can ace. A lot of it comes from what I like to call workshopping. So you back your way into it. You try, you screw up, you fumble, you try again, you screw up, you fumble. Oh, that doesn't feel right. Oh, maybe that feels a little bit better. Let me lean into that. Let me right? And you just kind of keep pivoting. That is how we actually get to an understanding of, oh, this is what my boundary is, regardless of category, right? So I'm giving you a little bit of kind of free rein to say, try it, stumble, screw up. It's all a part of it. You're not going to get it right every time or the first time, right? But yeah, so one takeaway I guess I would give you guys is an indicator, if you wanted to kind of take this away and think about it, right, for an area that you might need to put a little focus into is in those 6 categories, where do you feel depleted or resentful? Right? So if you can use the feeling of depletion or the emotion or the energy of resentment as an indicator, it'll help you know what of those 6 categories you really need to kind of strengthen, look at, roll around in, do some maybe, therapy work around, etc. Yeah? Okay.
So as you went through each category, a different person popped into mind, and I'm sure that happened for most of you. Um, my question to you is, however, about it's a little backwards, and I'll give you a quick story. I had a roommate in my very early 20s who had a very, is that better? She had boundaries, and we all kind of had to just fall out in line outside of those boundaries. My question is, and I'll give you a quick example. We would have friends over. When you have friends over, the expectation is you're both there hosting. She'd be done, and she'd leave me hosting. My question is, when people are so set in their boundaries, what's the rule there for you when your boundaries are maybe not quite as, set?
So that's a really good question. I think there's a couple things at play in that example, and that's actually a really great example. So, first and foremost, boundaries are a spectrum, right? They go from what we would call diffuse boundaries, which is I have zero boundaries, to walls, which is not actually a boundary, it's a wall, right? And then boundaries, actual healthy boundaries, kind of fall somewhere in between that. So, somebody saying, like, this is my boundary, take it or leave it, depends on what we're talking about. But in that, I would question a little bit of, is she really having boundaries or is she just kind of setting up walls, right? Now, what you're talking about around your own, like how you fall into that, example, this is where I start to lean into our work societally, especially as women, on our codependency, which is she's allowed to have her boundary and you're allowed to have yours. If you, for example, know that her MO is to be more of an introvert and after a little while needs to take care of herself, so she kind of disappears, right? Which, by the way, is my partner. We'll have like 30 people at our house, and all of a sudden I'm like, where's John? And he's napping. And I'm like, dude, I'm hosting 50 people in our backyard right now. But really, like, he's an introvert. He gets overwhelmed. He's like, I got to check out, and then he'll come back out, right? But that's on me. Because if I know that about him, and for some reason that frustrates me, makes me resentful, annoys me, whatever, and I continue to host parties with him, I got no one to blame but myself for my resentment, right? Now, if I like having parties with this person and I know this is how he is, like he needs to take a break, and then I know that about him and I choose to have those parties anyway, I just have to adjust my expectations, right, going into it. Or I can stop hosting parties with him. Honestly, it's really that simple, actually. Yeah.
Great answer. I am very curious, out of all of the 6 topics we heard, categories we heard, what are some of yours? What rang a bell to you? And do you have any questions about your own boundaries?
Yeah, the resentment, like I would love to know examples because I love workshopping this shit with you guys. When I said like feeling depleted or resentful, yeah.
Anyone? Boundary?
I'm not exactly remembering the category, but like for example, in business, there have been contracts signed, and then somebody doesn't like the way things are going, and so then they try to sort of manipulate outside of the agreement, and that's hard for me because it's very certain people make it very emotional versus very. What is that? Is that mental? Or is that?
Seen that as well.
I mean, that actually feels like it might cross a couple because you've got like financial stuff, you've got emotional stuff. I mean, I would say that it takes one of those conversations where you reiterate very non-emotionally, right? Like, this is the agreement that we signed. If you're not comfortable with this agreement, we need to have a larger conversation about breaking the agreement and what that entails, right? What kind of fees that entails, what kind of whatever, right? Your policies are, but really getting more. I was almost going to say like getting more confident in the way that you then kind of meet their emotion with non-emotion, right? Because it's not about necessarily like shaming them for their emotion. It's just like, listen, it's business, right? This actually, in this particular instance, doesn't really have emotion connected to it, right? This is what we agreed to. And I'm happy to have that conversation with you, but we need to also talk about what that's going to entail as far as like fees and things like this on the back end of it. It becomes a little bit more matter of fact. That does feel like a little bit of that financial boundary, more of that material boundary, and a little less of the emotional boundary, actually, for you anyway. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
I wanted to piggyback on that around like custody and separation. So I feel like it can feel very contractual, but there is emotion involved. So how do you set the boundary to allow that conversation with the emotion, but then you're still trying to follow a contract because you have something filed, you have lawyers and litigation involved. So I just want to talk about that.
So that's a good topic and one that comes up a lot, right? And it's hard to go in. This obviously it's nuanced depending on the situation, right? Depending on the partner and the background and all that stuff. But here's what I will say: broad statement. Again, going back to this idea that boundaries are about you and how you will respond and how you will hold yourself accountable. So let's use an example. Let's use an extreme example, right? I have a shitty partner who's verbally abusive. Okay. Let's just use this as the example. Yeah. I hear it a lot. Trust me, as a couples therapist, but also as a therapist. And every time we interact, I'm getting verbally abused, right? In some way. I am going to set that boundary and I'm going to say, I will no longer tolerate being spoken to this way. I don't allow anybody to speak to me this way. So from now on, when the language starts to turn abusive, I am going to stop responding to the messages. I am going to stop answering the phone call. I am going to let my lawyer know that they need to reach out to you and you guys can have the conversation, right? Or, those apps that they have where you can like engage with the person via app where there's actually social workers that monitor them. They exist for that reason, right? But again, a boundary is about how I will or will not allow myself to be treated. I have zero control over anybody else on this planet, children included, other than myself. I am only responsible for myself and keeping my side of the street clean. Period. Hard stop. I cannot control anybody else, right? So all I need to know when I walk away from any situation is, do I feel grounded and centered in my boundary? Did I respect myself in upholding this boundary, right? And, listen, there's a little bit of privilege at play because not everybody has the ability to say, well, screw it, if I'm just going to go to a lawyer, right, every time. But there are services that can help with that. And if it really is that bad, the other thing, again, about kids learning what they see, the kids, whether we realize it or not, they know what's going on. Okay? I'm letting everybody know that. I'm sure you know, but I'm telling you again. What they're going to see, mama, is they're going to see you respecting yourself at the end of the day. That's what they're going to see. They're going to see that mama loves herself so much that she does not allow anybody to treat her in any way that's not respectful. And that's what they're going to learn about themselves too, right? So a lot of times we'll do these things where we'll contort ourselves or we'll try to be nice or we'll be a little bit more manipulative to like control the situation for the sake of the kids. But at the end of the day, that's not actually the most helpful. A lot of times it's okay for them to see the struggle as long as they're seeing that you are staying true to yourself. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So speaking of kids, a long time ago, when my kids were little, and they're still little, they're 6 and 9, but when they were babies, I remember reading a ton of material on boundaries for kids. Something I read was, you don't force them to give hugs to relatives or friends. And I've kind of stuck with that. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Oh, I love this. My voice just got 5 octaves deeper. It's so relevant. And you know what? Look, it's also generational. Okay, because I think a lot of our parents and our parents just don't get this concept because it's really about give your auntie a kiss, give your grandma a hug. They love you. They got you a gift, right? And they get hurt feelings. Guess what? Nana's hurt feelings are not my 3-year-old's responsibility. Nana's a grown-ass adult. Nana can manage her own feelings, okay? And if Nana can't manage her own feelings at 70 years old, she's got bigger things to worry about, okay? And it's not my 3-year-old's responsibility. This is the actual breeding ground for codependency, for not having physical boundaries. Guess what? It has been proven, that's been researched, that children who the parents kind of continually push them on their physical boundaries. By the way, this is also like when they say no, when you're tickling them, you don't stop. This is things like that too, right? Any kind of physical boundary that child tries to, be articulate about, even if it's in like body language, they're also more prone to abuse these are also the children that have been shown to be the ones that become the victims because they've never been taught, again, we're taught boundaries. They've never been taught that their voice matters, that they're allowed to say no. They've always been taught that it's their job to take care of the adults' emotions in the room. And guess what that also turns into? People pleasers. Hi, me, right? That's what it breeds. And so I've had these conversations with my mom too. And again, it's like, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm her parent. And again, like it's not her job to manage your emotions. If you have hurt feelings because of a 3-year-old, I've got a couple referrals I can send you. You know? Yeah. I'm so passionate about this topic because I see it all the time. It's tough.
It's a tough one to tackle with family because in my house I see, my dad will ask for a hug and the boys are like, no. And they walk away and he looks at me and I'm like, no, he's not interested. Yeah. So, ladies, we have about 5 more minutes to this panel. Do we have any more questions?
Hi. What do you suggest to your clients who feel like their boundary is too rigid and it's interfering with their connections with other people?
So again, this is a little nuanced, right? Because what I'm going to say is not going to take into account things like trauma, right? Which can severely impact our ability to be vulnerable with other people, right? Which is a boundary thing. But if we're talking about somebody who particularly might just be more walled off, maybe they're more avoidant, right? When we're talking attachment styles, which again, hi, I'm here to represent the avoidance in the house. It's a baby steps process, right? So what happens when we're in that state of walled offness is our internal system is actually telling us like, it's fight or flight. It's dangerous, right? And that's not necessarily the truth of what's happening in that moment. That's obviously historical, but that is what's coming up. And so it really does feel life or death. A lot of times in order to kind of push past that, push feels a little aggressive, but lean into that maybe, it's going to be baby steps. It's going to be about finding people in your sphere that are safe, that feel safe, and allowing yourself to play with bringing the walls down in those relationships so that your nervous system and your psyche gets the message that it is safe sometimes to actually allow those walls to come down. I would never suggest to a client, for example, that she put her walls down, let's say, with an intimate partner first, because that actually, again, if we're talking about women, and again, trauma is a part of the conversation with most women at some point, that feels a little sticky to me. To me, it's more about what good friends do you have in your life? What support systems do you have in your life and have the conversations around them being trustworthy? How have they shown you in your life that you can trust them? Give me examples of when you have felt in your body safe around your best friend or around your children or whatever, right? And allow them to really feel into in their body what that feeling of safety has felt like. And then attempt to lean into that more. And what happens is you'll slowly build your resilience or your tolerance for the walls coming down so that you can then put it down in other scenarios that feel a little bit more dangerous. Now, in saying that, we also just have to listen to our internal systems sometimes. Like if my internal system is saying this person isn't safe, it's probably going to be really hard for me to override that. And that's a whole other avenue of work, I think, to do, right? Especially if we're talking about a couple. But I would say lean into the boundaries that they have, or not the boundaries, but the people they have in their life that are safe as like a felt experience to experiment with that feeling. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Why don't you let us know where everyone can find you so we can follow you, go to your websites, your Instagram?
All the things. I'm on Instagram as just Vanessa S. Bennett. It was my personal turned public profile. I have a book called It's Not Me, It's You that recently came out with me and my partner. He's also a therapist. VanessaBennett.com. And yeah, Cheaper Than Therapy is my podcast.
Thank you so much, Vanessa.